Okay, let's talk about Oreos. If you're black and you're listening to this, you're going to find out something about yourself. The thing you're going to find out is to what degree you are white. And this is based on academic research from reputable social anthropologists and critical theorists. This is based on a model called the Wilson-Crowder scale. It is a spectrum. So depending on where you fall on the Wilson-Crowder scale, you will determine today how white you are. So here we go. Here we have Russell Wilson and Channing Crowder on a 1 to 10 gradient. Wilson being a 10, and Crowder of course being the benchmark for blackness. So take a moment to determine where you fall on the Wilson-Crowder scale. Who is your personality closer to, Channing Crowder or Russell Wilson? Is it somewhere in between? Are you a 2? Are you a 6? Okay, did you make your determination? Time's up. Alright, if you fall anywhere on the spectrum to the right of Channing Crowder, then you are somewhat white. If you are a 5, then you literally suffer from identity confusion. If you are a 6 and above, then you are basically a white guy. See how ridiculous this is? This is basically how we see ourselves.
Yeah, if Russell ain't had that bread, she ain't gonna be with him. Russell Square. Russell Square. Russell Square. Sierra had a she has a good situation, but you don't leave Future and get with Russell Wilson.
The thing is,
I think that's what
you
you're
don't
wrong,
leave
though.
Future and get Russell Wilson. Like, it's a type. Listen, bro, everybody got a type.
Yeah, that's true.
Everybody has a type. You gonna leave Future and get with Russell Wilson?
When you
He's so goddamn square, and I love him on the field. He's a square.
Based on Crowder's logic, Ryan Clark is whiter than he is because he's somewhat pushing back. Fred Taylor is whiter than he is. And I'm not just saying this, there's evidence. Because when Patrick Surtain II pushed back just a bit, here was Crowder's response.
I know dudes that I want to hang with. I grew up in Atlanta, and I know guys I want to hang with.
Yeah.
I don't want to hang with Russ.
Why you think that, though?
Cause he put mousse in his hair and slick it sideways. He ain't no type of dude.
I come and defend Russ.
I fool with dudes like your daddy. That's the man I want to hang with. I don't want to hang with Russ. I want to hang with RC. I want to hang with Freddie.
Yeah.
You on the edge, because I just hung with you as a grown man. I got to see what your grown man attitude is.
And by the way, it's not just personality, it's also geography. If you live primarily in white spaces, you are trending toward Wilson on the Wilson-Crowder scale. And this from reputable critical theorist types.
For these boys that grow up in these all-white areas that feel compromised in their blackness, they don't really get solid images of blackness to mimic from the media. They may not have the best role models around them. They probably are surrounded by black men and women who are sellouts themselves, or they wouldn't have taken their kids out to the fucking suburbs to raise them among all white people. Stop doing that shit to your kids, y'all. I'm sorry.
Identity confusion and internalized anti-blackness by virtue of growing up in white spaces. Alright, those of us who think this way, I want you to take a look at something.
I don't care what people don't like. They got mad when I said I don't support Black Lives Matter, because who they matter to? We kill each other all day. We talk about each other all day. You know who talk about me the most on the internet? Niggas. Niggas. You know what's worse than a nigga? 2 of them. Make you don't want to be a nigga. You know how niggas go to jail? Cause niggas tell on niggas. It's a 98% conviction rate amongst blacks. They tell. You ain't know that? That's what niggas do. They just talk good as a bitch. That's all they do. They tell. We was taught wrong. We be having this, man, watch out for the white man. Man, I ain't never had no problem with no white. It been niggas. And I like, it's crazy. Like, even in jail, I'm like, okay, we gonna stick together and ride in this bitch. They giving the black people cold food. Man, when we stood up in that bitch, come on, let's scuffle. We gonna fight with the police, come on. When they came in there with them guns, them fucking baby powder guns, them, you know, that fox spray and all that, you know what them niggas did me? They all went got in their wreck. It was me, probably 2 other black dudes and a Mexican. The warden even told me, I respect you, you're a man, start sticking by yourself. When I changed my people, places, and things, and changed my perspective, you know, police speak to me like, it's police that done arrested me and all of that. They speak to me now and say they proud of me.
Okay, let's go to Russell Wilson.
When you think about the idea of Black Lives Matter, they do matter. And the reality is that me as a black person, you know, people are getting murdered on the street, people are getting shot down, and the understanding that, you know, it's not like that for every other race. And, you know, I think about, my stepson, I think about, my daughter, I think about our new baby boy on the way. And it's kind of staggering. It's staggering to watch these things happen right in front of our faces.
Who seems to be more confused? Who seems to be suffering more from internalized anti-blackness? Forgive me, I have to pause here for a moment because this is weird. This man, Kevin Gates, no fault of his own, has no idea what he's talking about. And this is indicative of an interesting dynamic that happens specifically within the black community, in which individuals in their formative years, while growing up, have little to no interaction with white people, are intuitively aware of white cultural hegemony at an early age, often as early as elementary school, because whiteness is so ubiquitous in television and in film. Their first representations of heroism are overwhelmingly white. Their first associations with wealth and power are white, and then they reach adolescence and, for the first time, become aware of their position in society, being desperately poor, sometimes living in deplorable conditions, and they begin looking for descriptives or useful heuristics that would explain their circumstances, and, because they attend a geographically and racially isolated school, they are more likely to receive what is often referred to in education as cultural responsive learning, which, for brevity's sake, could be understood as a proto-CRT, which essentially is an outcropping of African American studies. All of a sudden, Kevin Gates has a paradigm to understand his positioning in society, and that paradigm is systemic racism, which as a descriptive is valid but is inherently limited because its only means of describing a very real structural problem in America is to reify both races, white and black. So the only way to talk about white people is to talk about whiteness, and whiteness is a reification. It's kind of a fusion of people with concepts. Theory has no other choice but to do this. It doesn't know how to talk about systemic racism without doing this. In fact, it's impossible. So whiteness becomes a fusion of white people and dominance, and blackness becomes a fusion of black people and oppression, which usefully describes a system but also reduces living, breathing human beings into simple archetypes. This is why it is impractical, even dangerous, to introduce critical race theory to children. They have not the wherewithal to process these concepts without being incredibly reductive, particularly while their prefrontal cortex is still developing. So that, by time they reach adulthood, they have an incredibly reductive understanding of people in general. So Kevin Gates, with little to no exposure to actual white people, naturally associates white people with generally negative things, even outright villainy. He may even hate them for a time, until, one day, because of the financial success he's able to achieve through music, he has occasion to interact with more actual white people, and, inevitably, he has a few positive interactions with some of them. And all of a sudden he's brought back to his childhood when his first television heroes were white, and everything he associated with the best of things and the warm and fuzzies of childhood TV favorites, his first heroes, are now affirming him as an individual. And he's gleeful, like a child meeting his hero, who stoops down and rubs his head. I mean, listen to this man.
The warden even told me, I respect you, you're a man, start sticking by yourself. When I changed my people, places, and things, and changed my perspective, you know, police speak to me like, it's police that done arrested me and all of that. They speak to me now and say they proud of me.
Can you see Al Roker, or Brian Gumble, or Keegan Michael Key, or any other black person who grew up in so-called white spaces being elated that some white dude says I respect you, you're a man. They grew up amongst white people. A white dude is just a dude, nothing more. There would be nothing notable or inspirational for them, like it is for Kevin Gates to be told by a white guy that he's proud of them. They literally would not give a shit. But look at how Kevin Gates' eyes twinkle at the compliment. Look how he beams. He's so proud of it, bless his heart. But I would wager Alan Roker, Brian Gumbel, Keegan-Michael Key would not be flattered by this warden's compliment. They'd probably be insulted. It's pretty close to a backhanded compliment. A backhanded compliment that neither the giver nor the receiver of the compliment is even aware of its backhandedness. Who would need affirmation that they're a man but someone who doubts it within themselves? And who would even presume to give affirmation but someone who consciously or not feels the sense of superiority to grant it? But poor Kevin Gates is too mesmerized by the warden to even notice. So he'll go on and reformulate the reductive heuristic that well-meaning teachers gave him when he was in high school through African American studies and other identity-based content because his positive interactions with white people don't correlate with it. He'll reformulate his worldview. And he'll think back to all of his negative interactions and come to a revelation that they all involve black people, not realizing that the only reason they typically involved black people is that, throughout much of his life, his only intimate interactions, good or bad, almost exclusively involved black people. That's just a consequence of living in predominantly black spaces. Just like a white person who grows up in predominantly white spaces will receive almost all of their negative interactions from other white people. But you would never hear them go on such a diatribe about how shitty white people are. Because ultimately they're not walking around with a giant unprocessed inferiority complex. A combination of growing up isolated from quote-unquote white spaces and his only early conception of them being either hyperreal TV heroes or abstractions of oppression based on culturally responsive pedagogy in high school, which is cobbled together by his teachers from writings of critical theorists and professors of African American studies, gave him a binary for understanding an entire group of people. They could only be heroes or villains. And the moment they became heroes, based on the binary he was given, his own people had to become the villains. This man really believes that the majority of black people engage in violence towards each other and inform the police on one another. That's a consequence of the binary he was given. That's Kanye West's story. That's Officer Tatum's story. That's Jason Whitlock's story. That's not Russell Wilson's story. That's not Keegan-Michael Key's story. That's not Donald Glover's story. That's not Jordan Peele's story. The worldview these guys were given as children, so-called Oreos, don't have that binary. By and large, they are able to recognize that the people they grew up with are no different from them. They're neither heroes nor villains. Can you imagine Sam Richardson saying,
You know what's worse than a nigga? Two of them. Make you don't want to be a nigga. You know how niggas go to jail? Cause niggas tell on niggas.
Yeah, probably not. Pretty sure his view of people, in general, is a little bit more nuanced, a little less reductive. We should probably rethink this whole Oreo concept. And the only way to properly do that is to take a look at the history of Oreos. For the 2 or 3 of you who don't know, an Oreo is a term used to describe a black individual who grew up primarily in white spaces and consequently identify culturally more so with those spaces than they do black spaces. It could be said that these individuals don't read as culturally black. There's a disjunction between their phenotypical appearance and their cultural preferences. These individuals can be derided by peers and other groups who did not share a similar experience and will consequently see these individuals as inauthentic, as lame, as putting on a performance when, if these individuals attempted to take on the cultural cues of what is often read as typically black, they would ironically feel quite inauthentic. Yet these individuals can feel alienated from the white spaces in which they were first socialized. You might have heard the line from the rapper Earl Sweatshirt, too black for the white kids and too white for the black.
Too black for the white kids and too white for the blacks.
This is a sentiment that these individuals can certainly relate to. To properly unpack this discussion, it's useful to deconstruct the origins of what is understood to be the Oreo. Of course, we contextualize the Oreo as a black person who reads as culturally white, hence its metaphoric derivation. But the history of this phenomenon extends beyond blackness and is as old as America itself. What is often characterized as a black-centered phenomenon can actually be identified within the communities of early American immigrants. You might be familiar with the quintessential image of European immigrants disembarking onto Ellis Island after arriving from Eastern and Western Europe. These newly arriving immigrants would often face immediate ostracization from so-called native-born Americans and, as a result, felt tremendous pressure to assimilate into American culture. These newly arriving immigrants did, however, come through Ellis Island, bringing with them strong cultural traditions that were deeply wedded to their identities and therefore found it challenging to balance cultural assimilation into American life while maintaining the cultural identity of the families they left behind in Europe. Of course, this cultural and social dynamic had varying manifestations, with some immigrants feeling much more pressure to assimilate while others found the pressure to remain true to the customs and cultural idioms of their native countries to be much more pronounced. This would inevitably cause tensions within these immigrant communities, as those more beholden to native customs would recognize what they perceived as inauthenticities in their much more rapidly assimilating neighbors. However, these same immigrants who saw themselves as maintaining the customs and cultural identities that they left behind in Europe would be shocked to hear from their own relatives when returning to visit that they themselves had unwittingly become Americanized and had taken on unconscious cultural traits that seemed wholly out of step with their culture of origin left behind in Europe. This sort of internalization of the dominant culture, despite their best efforts to resist it, contextualizes how the children of those immigrants would take on the traits of the dominant culture to the point where they would conceivably identify more so with the adopted culture than the culture of their parents, particularly when even their parents, who were much more willful to retain cultural continuity to their own country, would, despite of themselves, begin to take on characteristics of the dominant culture. Yet even the dominant American culture, which was made up primarily of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, even during the pre-revolutionary colonial period, they themselves had a complicated relationship with their British antecedents. The American aristocracy at the time, basically the American rich, was divided between perceived Anglophiles, which was colonial America's own version of the Oreo, which is to say an American, quote-unquote, acting British. Sound familiar? American white people would call each other out for acting too British. You had proud American-born whites who recognized and embraced their own culture separate from the larger, oppressive British culture. Of course, the irony was that even these proud native-born white American colonials with their distinctly American culture still unself-consciously spoke English and practiced a culture that, though being distinct from British culture, certainly wasn't in America before they arrived. Even with their distinct Americanisms, without realizing it, they were still very much acting British. So those of us who are black, who might see what we might perceive as Oreo behavior in other black people, no matter how culturally black you think you are, if you were to visit Africa, you would present in such a way that, although distinctly African American, would be totally unfamiliar to many native Africans. To them, you would be an Oreo. Go hang out with the Hadza of Tanzania and try to be as authentically black as you think you are. You will still come off to them as a white-influenced Westerner. The African American culture to this day remains one of the most vibrant and innovative in the world, to the point where it continues to be appropriated as the preferred center of American popular culture as it's been in one form or another since the 1920s. But those in the African American community identifying other black people as Oreos might remind themselves that African American culture itself might not have developed were it not for those who would today be considered Oreos. The African American musician Scott Joplin, for instance, immersed himself in white American brass band music, which was at the time, during the late 19th century, the most popular musical genre in America, and out of that, he developed ragtime, which would go on to become the first popular African American genre ever. Jazz architects like Cab Calloway immersed themselves in European classical music and, in response, created something wholly original and what is widely considered the first instance of a globally recognized African American art form. Out of that would eventually emerge a distinct African American culture which included jazz and jive, which in turn would influence American pop culture itself, where African American idiom could be identified in mainstream popular culture as early as the 1920s, when African American slang had already been appropriated by much of America itself, to the point where anyone who wanted to be considered worldly and cosmopolitan would have to be seen listening to jazz and using African American colloquialism. And hip-hop today. What do you think the early founders of hip-hop were sampling during the 1970s? Lost Ketchup, Mila, Alan Hawkshaw. And the reason they were sampling it was because they liked the music. They were the lame ones listening to lame music. But they deconstructed it and transformed it into nothing short of the most influential popular culture in the world today. I could say with relative certainty that these individuals considered by their peers to be Oreos see themselves as the black individuals that they are. If you by chance meet a black person who thinks that he or she is white, then they're probably psychotic or schizophrenic or have some other serious mental health disorder. So they will by and large see themselves as black and will be quite comfortable with it, in many cases pleased with it, but in the cultural sense, they would be somewhat nomadic. They would sort of drift between cultures. That might sound alienating and estranged, but that's usually how cultural innovation happens, when an individual is in a space where he is the only one like himself. It's sort of the fictional archetype of the Wanderer, characters like the Mandalorian, Boba Fett, the Man with No Name, Django Freeman, K-Chong Kane, Nick Carraway, the nameless character in The Invisible Man. These kinds of characters often find themselves in spaces in which they are the only ones like themselves and, as a result, are able to glean insights about the spaces that those who are positioned at the center of them would be far too enmeshed to be self-aware. There's a kind of third-person perspective that these individuals occupy, like the narrator in a novel. Black people, in general, will have some familiarity with this mode of existence just by virtue of being black in predominantly white America. And there's a kind of double consciousness that was first described by Du Bois in his conception of blackness in America. So it would stand to reason that this double consciousness would be felt much more acutely by black individuals who literally came of age in white spaces and possess a fluency for those spaces both linguistically and in terms of cultural expression. Critics of these individuals will often associate that double consciousness with being apologists for structural racism, even being agents of it. Which, to be sure, you might observe in individuals like Candace Owens, Paris Denard, Larry Elder, Thomas Sowell, Officer Tatum, Jason Whitlock. These people could very well indeed be guilty of that. Yet, there are also examples of black individuals who were immersed in white spaces and were able to offer insightful commentary or even outright political activism against structural racism. Du Bois himself was one of them. Malcolm X attended an all-white school as a child. Frederick Douglass spent much of his public life in white spaces. The brilliant James Baldwin with his transatlantic, Gore Vidal-like accent, Langston Hughes, Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, Arthur Ashe. That's quite the distinguished list, and certainly to be credited with much of the cultural and social progress we've made in this country. All of whom could be characterized as Oreos. All of those people, in terms of their personalities and temperament and cultural tastes, would most likely have been deemed by the very people they helped to champion to be on the wrong side of the Wilson-Crowder scale. They would all be characterized as Oreos. Yet if we have any freedoms in this country today, we owe much of it to them. Like, subscribe, and support the Golden Ratio by joining our Patreon down in the link